One of the questions that I get asked the most is, how do you read and research and take notes in a way that is effective? Now, I'm just entering the third year of my PhD, which means I'm currently writing up my thesis. It's got a word limit of about 100,000 words, which means that I'm in the midst of summarizing essentially 2 or 3 years worth of research. That's a pretty difficult task, but it's something which I'm only able to do because of the hundreds of essays that I've written and marked and read over the past 7 years. So what I want to do in this video is make 6 different observations about the process of reading and researching for essay writing and for dissertation writing, which hopefully should help you. The first thing to bear in mind is that reading for work is purposive. That is to say that it's not the same as just reading a fiction book in your spare time or reading a non-fiction book in your spare time, because in those instances, often you're just reading in a leisurely pace, you're observing the things the author is saying, you get to think about them a bit, and that's just not true of academic work, where you always need to have a purpose in mind behind the things that you're reading. That means that you can't just go in and not have any idea what's going on, unless it's the case that you're reading an overview book or a survey history, for example, in which case you might be just trying to get a grasp of the field. In all other instances, you need to have a question in mind or an idea in mind before you even start reading the book. You need to think about what you're trying to get out of this. The second thing, and that essentially comes from the purposiveness of reading for research, is to be selective about the readings. Because ultimately, and you know this just as well as I do, you have limited time and you also have limited energy. And you don't want to spend any of that time doing things that you don't need to be doing or that aren't going to be helpful to you. So if you find yourself reading through a book and just not getting it at all, feeling like it's pointless, not understanding why the lecturer set that as a reading in the first place, then that's probably you doing it wrong. And that often means that you're reading the wrong thing. Now you might be thinking, well, surely that's what the reading list is for, right? I'm just meant to go through all of it. But in most instances, there are only a few things that you really need to read in order to get a core grasp of the field that you're in. The rest of the reading list, often what's the recommended reading, is usually for very specific purposes. It's often for one essay topic, or it's to try and get a bigger backstory on one specific thing. In addition to that, lecturers, when they're setting reading lists, will often throw in things which they think might be interesting to their students, or which might help some people doing a particular thing, and they don't want them to not be able to find them when they're doing that essay. And that means that often they'll err on the side of caution and put in things that are less likely to be helpful, rather than leaving them out and risk not being able to find them. The consequence of that links back to the purposiveness of reading, because it essentially means that you need to look through the reading list critically and begin thinking, what do I need to look at? Now, some of that might be looking at the titles of the things. Now, if it's clearly unrelated, probably don't do it. But in many instances, you won't be able to tell just from the title. And so the solution there is to find the contents of the book or to find an abstract of the article and to read that and see and think to yourself, does this make sense? Does this seem relevant to what I'm trying to do? If it doesn't, then you probably don't have time to read the whole thing, and maybe you should read a tiny bit of it just to make sure, but ultimately you're probably going to want to disregard it, because that means that you're not wasting time on something that isn't going to help you. Now, a lot of books have a lot of chapters by different authors, and it might be that you need to read the abstract or the introduction for each of those just to make sure that you're not doing anything wrong, or just to make sure that the things in there aren't going to be useful to you. But if they're not, again, discard it. There's plenty of other readings to be done. So that then means that what you're left with usually are the core readings that are going to be pertinent to the subject which you're trying to get into. The third thing to bear in mind is that books are written in academia to be broken. Now, what that essentially means is that often they'll have an introduction and a conclusion which summarize the whole argument of the book, and then individual chapters in the middle which go into detail about particular things. Now, that means that the book itself, yes, is kind of a cohesive whole, but also it can be read bit by bit. And that means that often the whole argument we summarize in the intro and then maybe a bit in conclusion, which might also talk about other work you might want to read. But also the introduction will include a bit at the end which says, in chapter 1, I do this. In chapter 2, I do this. In chapter 3, I do this, and so on. And that's designed specifically so that students like you are able to read selectively and pick out the bits of the book that are most likely to be relevant to them. So that means that Whether you're reading a book or an article, which often tend to do the same thing, they'll often have an intro which summarizes the argument and then methods and results and discussion and conclusions, you are able to pick it apart and make sure you're not reading the whole thing. Because it's very rare, if you're writing an essay or a dissertation, that you're going to need to read the whole book. And if you do, it's likely you only need to read one, maybe two for any given task. With that in mind, you can select individual chapters which you want to read, maybe one or two of those in the middle, and then make sure you read the intro and the conclusion so that you get the gist of the author's argument. The fourth thing that I would say is that you need to document your readings, because one of the things that can often get quite confusing towards the end of a larger project is thinking about what it is you've actually done. With that in mind, a quick plug for a piece of referencing software. I would personally get Zotero, which is a free piece of reference management software, which allows you to simply click a single button in your web browser and save all the details of any given text or book into a library. And then from there, you can, in Word or whatever Word processing software you use, you can click another button and it will give you a fully formed reference in whatever style you like. And then finally at the end, you can click a final button and that will give you the whole bibliography just in one click. And that will probably save you hours of sweat, blood, and tears. And so that's probably quite a useful way of making sure that you both are aware of what you're reading and how much stuff you've done so that you can keep an eye on that, and also so that you don't lose track of anything. Now let's look at note-taking. So there are a couple of ways to go about this. One is to dive straight into a book and know what you're looking for and to be annotating the whole time, making sure that you're getting relevant quotes, that you're writing down relevant thoughts about what the author is saying and how it might pertain to, say, the essay question which you're working on right now. The second way of doing it is, if you're not entirely certain what you're looking for at first, is to read the whole thing and then get the gist of it in your head and then go back and reread it with a much more sharp, critical eye about the kinds of things you might want to be looking for. In either of these instances, what I tend to do is to get block quotes. So one of the ways that I read is I will literally have a computer in front of me as well as the book, and I will type out entire quotes from the text. Now, that's obviously easier if you've got an article in front of you or if you've got an ebook which you can copy from. But for me, it's a way of feeling like I'm able to concentrate on the book and on what I'm doing at the same time as thinking about why that thing might be relevant to me. And so what I end up with is a big document with a whole chunk of block quotes in it. And then what I do there is I put in little square brackets my thoughts about how that might be relevant to particular parts of my argument. From there, what I do to construct it into some kind of argument is I'll often have headings in my essay about different things that I'm trying to prove, different points I'm trying to get across. And then I will take those block quotes and I'll put them under those headings because I think they're likely to fit into those sections. Now, obviously, the whole quote isn't going to make its way in there, but what I can then do is I can say, at worst, Smith 2005 says this, and then I can delete the quote from the Word document, but leave it in my notes document so it's still there if I need it later. Now, the point of that is it means that you're not just writing down what the author is saying and not commenting on it at all. You're adding your own critical thought to it as well, and then trying to weave it into your argument. Now, it might be that you need to go back all the way to the first and second readings you did at the beginning in order to understand how the things you did later on link into those things when you have a more complete understanding. But the idea is that you still have it there and you can refer back to it as a way of synthesizing your whole argument. Now, the final thing I would say is that one of the most important things about reading and note-taking is finding more readings. Because if you're an undergraduate student, for example, the thing that's going to take you above and beyond everyone else is, yes, partly going to be originality or creativity with the argumentation. It's partly going to be analytical rigor, but it's also going to be how broadly and how deep you've read and how well you're able to draw upon and synthesize those readings. Now, there are a couple of ways of doing this. One is to go through the reading list really carefully and comb through and make sure that you're getting everything. But the other is to use the readings that you've already got. Now, there are a couple of ways to go about that. The first is to look through the reading, and if you've got a block quote which you see as useful to you, then to find who they've referenced in that quote, and then look for that reference in the bibliography, and then look up that book. Or that article, and then read the abstract of it. If it looks like it's going to be helpful to you, read it, and then do the same thing with that. Take any quotes that you need, essentially strip it for parts, and if it's not useful, throw it away. And you do that over and over again with every single set of quotes that you get. You look and make sure that there's no good citation in there, because if there is, you want to be looking it up and you want to be using it. Now, the problem with that is it only gives you the past, because articles obviously can only cite things that have only happened prior to their existence. And so what you really want to be doing is also thinking about, well, what's come after this? Because if you're stuck in, say, year 2000, you're only going to be citing things from the 20th century. It might be your field has really evolved since then. So one of the key things you can do is type the name of the article or the book that you're reading into Google Scholar, which is a really good service. And then there's a little button which will say this has been cited by 150 people, for example. You can click that, and then that will give you a list of all of the articles which have cited the article or book that you're putting into the search engine. What that allows you to do is then skim through those, see if there are any titles or abstracts which look like they might be useful to you, and then do exactly the same thing to those articles or to those books. And what that does then is it really fleshes out your reading list in such a way that it's unlikely that anyone who's marking your essay or your dissertation will have seen everything on it. And that means that it's very clear that you've gone above and beyond in producing your piece of work. So I hope you found this helpful. I'm hoping to produce some more videos which go through questions about both university life and academic life more generally, as well as hoping to pick apart some papers and books and stuff I've been reading and present those concepts in a way that's accessible to people but won't require them to spend hours and hours of their lives reading them, or indeed, I suppose, 7 years at this point, getting degrees which are necessary in order to be able to critically dissect the arguments in and of themselves. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, then please do subscribe, and I hope to see you again.